Good morning. Happy Wednesday. Yesterday I tweeted about the full moon in Leo and what was I talking about? How Moon, Venus, Mars, Saturn are currently all in fire signs. And that really defined the moment of the full moon. Fire signs do stuff. They move. So there's been a lot of movement in people's lives, collectively. I feel like the news cycle around the full moon was super duper active and lots of revelations and things like that. That was ice. Also because the full moon was very close to the degree of the August 21st, 2017 eclipse, which was a total eclipse in Leo. So anyways, that's not what I got on here to talk about today. I kind of want to take it back to the not so basic basics. Whenever I come on here and talk about astrology, I recognize that a large part of my work is education. I mean, I have Jupiter and Sagittarius on my ascendant, so I'm a teacher. Like, that's what I've always been and always done, so this is no different. But one of the things that I don't take for granted is that there really is a consensus on what astrology is and what its purpose and function is. Like, I feel like there's definitely not a consensus on that. Number one, because I think that we have preconceived notions about what astrology is in our minds. And when we come together to talk about astrology, we don't really lay a groundwork for what actually is astrology. Many people who have not heard of a birth chart or anything like that, they think astrology is horoscopes based on your sun sign, and that there are like these 12 prototypes that astrology uses to define people. It's very simplistic, and I always say that people who view astrology that way are the same people who would say that the English language is comprised of the alphabet, right? That's what English is. It's the alphabet, right? Not really taking into consideration the cultural context for language, and that the alphabet is really just the basic building blocks of language. Like numbers are the basic building block of math. There is much implied in the structure and way that we count, or in the variety of languages that there are, the alphabet or building blocks or characters that make up the language, but those things are not the language itself. So we can say the same thing of astrology, that the 12 zodiac signs are not astrology itself, right? So that brings me to my topic for today. What is astrology? And if I have time, I will get to the tropical versus sidereal zodiac, but I feel like this might take all of my morning live time talking about what is astrology. This is a very difficult question to ask, because we can break down anything into its pieces. We can dissect it into its parts. So we can say astrology is planets, signs, and houses, right? But that's not really telling me what astrology is, why it is, or how it functions. Part of why I want to talk about this today is on my morning drive today, I was thinking about like what I actually do when I sit down with a client, and how I'm looking at this person's chart. I don't know them from Adam or Eve or Steve or whatever their names are. And I am able to tell them about their mother and their father and their home and their family and their interest and their health and their illness and the times of important events in their lives, and help them piece together a story. And I'm in awe every day, but this morning in particular, I was like, man, what is astrology that I can do this with it? Thank you. What is astrology that I can do this with it? That I can read and I almost want to say tell the story of someone's life without them giving me any information. What is the power of these symbols? So that's why I'm talking about this today. How I talk about astrology today and how I define astrology is not necessarily something I've sat down and come up with other astrologers. It's not something that I've read somewhere. It's not something that you can go find in a book somewhere. I won't say that my ideas are completely original. I feel like everything is derivative in life, right? Nothing is completely original. So with that being said, as I understand astrology, astrology is a language, right? And language is a tool, right? Astrology is a language. And when I say language is a tool, what I mean is that language is a complex set of symbols that we use to think about, visualize, and talk about ourselves and the world around us. I'm going to say that again. Language is a tool, and by that I mean it is a complex set of symbols that change in time and space, right? That are rooted in culture and history, that we use to think about, visualize, talk about, and name the world around us. So astrology is that. It is a language. Astrology is a complex set of symbols used to think about, visualize, talk about, and name ourselves and the world around us. Okay? Now, astrology is also a tool for naming, measuring, and interpreting time, right? So we have two basics here. Astrology is a language like English or French or music or poetry or whatever it is, right? Astrology is a language, and I've just explained what that means, okay? But astrology is also a tool for measuring, naming, and here's where it gets really, really, really interesting. Not only for measuring and naming time, but interpreting time, okay? So there are a variety of language, this complex set of symbols. There are a variety of ways we name and measure time. We use clocks, right? We use calendars, right? And each of those particular tools segment time in ways that are predictable, right? But also understanding that time is a consensus. We have agreed that this is what 1 hour, 1 year, 1 day, 1 week, 1 minute, 1 second, 1 month, right? A decade, a century, right? There's a consensus around what those things mean, so that when I say 1 week, I don't have to explain that to you. You know what that is, okay? So, what is going on? So astrology is just like that calendar. It's just like a clock, right? Astrology names and measures time, right? For example, we observe the astronomical phenomenon of how planets appear to move from Earth, right? And with that, we are able to designate a period of time in relation to that. The period of time, for example, that is correlated to 1 year is the sun cycle. Why? Because it takes 360 blank 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 days for 1 year. But implied in that astronomical measurement is that the sun is doing something observable, predictable, and repeatable, right? Just like in 1 day, right? We're watching the earth do something in relationship to the sun, right? So astrology as a tool for measuring and naming time, okay, tells us about how we can perceive ourselves in space and time. So each planet has its own cycle in this sense, right? The moon has a 29 day cycle, right? Mercury varies, Venus varies, right? Jupiter has 12 years, Saturn has 29 years, right? So all of these planets, and this is not astrological in the sense of there is no interpretation yet. This is purely astronomical, right? It is astronomical, measurably, predictably observable that Saturn is doing this thing in 29 years. The moon is doing this thing in 29 days. The sun is doing this thing in 30 days, in 365 days, right? Now, astrology gets very interesting because unlike calendars and unlike clocks, astrology interprets time. It tells us what it means, okay? So, in that sense, I say astrology helps us to name and define and interpret the seasons and the times of our lives. There's a time and season for all things, right? This is something that, again, is not necessarily a spiritual concept, but it does have a spiritual implication. When we say there's a time and season for all things, we know that at particular times of year, based on how much sunlight there is, how much rain or not there is, whatever the temperature is, we know that there's an appropriate thing to do at that particular time, and that we organize our lives around the seasons. We organize our lives around the hours of daylight and nighttime. We organize our lives in this way so that we know that there is an appropriate time to do things. This is where, again, astrology gets really interesting, because we think about that in relationship to our physical bodies, how we grow our food, how we eat, how we sleep, the schedule that we have in our bodies and in our lives. But we don't always think about that regarding the choices that we make and the undertakings we choose to endeavor upon at any given space and time. Again, this is where astrology gets really interesting, because now, because astrology interprets time, it tells us what is happening and what it means or what it's connected to, right? And that it helps us to build a narrative around a particular story. Now, we can say, not only is there a time and season for planting food, for harvesting, for sowing, for tilling, there is also a time for things to happen in our own lives. So my favorite scripture to reference in this context talks about there's a time for death and birth, growth, conservation, joy, celebration, atonement, right? There's a time for all of these things. Yet and still, as a culture, we have not really grasped the both practical and spiritual significance of that truth. Right? Astrology is this tool that helps us do that. Okay? So now let's get to the real meat of it. I've established that in this conversation that astrology is a language which is a complex set of symbols that we use to name, visualize, think about, and talk about ourselves and the world around us, right? Astrology is just like that. I've also established that astrology is a tool for measuring, naming, and interpreting time, just like clocks and calendars, except for there's the added dimension of, but what does that mean, right? Astrology helps us in that regard, okay? Now, the next piece is, if astrology is a language, what is the alphabet? What is the syntax of it, right? In any language, there is a lexicon, there's a syntax, there's a correspondence of these symbols to some concept or object, person or place in our world, right? What is the grammar? What does it mean, right? What is the pieces that we pull together to make this language, right? So in languages, we have alphabets. Each letter makes a sound. And depending on how the letters come together, the sound of that letter is going to change. And even the sounds that letters make are very culturally significant and specific, right? If you hear English and the derivatives of English, or the language that English is derived from, Latin, the Romance languages, Germanic languages, native words, right? English is really an amalgamation of all of the colonial exploits of England, right? So in that sense, it's a cultural thing, right? But if we go to China, right, it's a totally different way of organizing the symbols, right? They have characters, which are pictures, and those are very deep and complex, and how they're organized in the syntax, right? I was listening to, I don't know if you guys read the book Barracoon by Zora Neale Hurston. It was finally published after years of not being published. And there was a story on NPR where they were talking about the importance that Zora Neale Hurston felt that Kosula, the character for whom the book is written, able to tell his story in his own dialect. And there was a linguist, and the woman I think who was responsible for publishing the book, who came on this show, and she was talking about the importance of preserving the way that Kosula talked about himself, because in the culture that he came from, there was no I, right? She was explaining how in American Western culture, there's this constant reinforcement of I say, I do, I feel, I think, where in his culture, I is implied. He's standing right here before you, so he doesn't have to say I, right? So this is the complexity of language, and I explain that because I want to apply this and help you understand something about astrology. As with any language, astrology emerges from a cultural and historical point. So astrology is not something that's uniquely Western, right? It's not uniquely European or American. Astrology is Indian. Astrology is Babylonian and Sumerian and Mesopotamian. Astrology is Kemetic. Astrology is the Asiatic diaspora, practiced in Korea and China, in Singapore, Malaysia. And each of these astrologies emerges from the culture, emerges from a historical narrative around how culture develops and how people operate amongst each other in communities and in that culture, okay? So when we pull together the building block pieces of any astrology, we always start with the sun and the moon, which are not planets, right? The sun is a star. It is the biggest star, the closest star. And the moon is not a planet either. The moon is, for all intents and purposes, a big old rock that is Earth's moon. And it is really something that we observe as a marker of time and have for time immemorial, right? So much of our orientations towards our body and the world are rooted in the moon and the observation of the moon. Again, not necessarily anything astrological at this point, but purely astronomical, in that we watch the moon wax and wane in its light, okay? So all astrological traditions start with those two pieces, right? Then we spread out to other bodies that are observable with the naked eye. So you have to remember, telescopes weren't always a thing. So this brings up another piece that's really important to astrology, is that it's a visual art. It's a visual thing, right? I know we have all of these complex words and concepts and things, that this sign is this and that planet is that, and but astrology is first an observable phenomenon rooted in astronomy. There was a time where astronomy and astrology were no different. They were the same thing. And at some point, once there was a power struggle around access to knowledge and language and the written word, these two things get split up, because now science becomes this thing that is separate from, rather than something that is practiced by clergy or the aristocracy who had the time and leisure to study and learn math and all of these things, okay? So we start with the sun and moon, and then we move to the observable bodies that are visible with the naked eye. So now that's Mercury, that's Venus, that's Mars, that's Jupiter, and that's Saturn, right? So in observing the cycles, purely astronomical, of these planets, we begin to understand how these bodies, or wandering stars as they called, the cycles of these stars and the time frames that they represent. So let's see, every day in this segment of time, the sun is doing the same thing over here in the east, but then it does something else over here in the west. Observe, record. Okay, the moon is doing this today, but 29 days ago it did this same thing. Observe and record. whoa, Mercury is doing this thing, but then it's doing this thing and that thing and this thing and that thing and this thing. Venus, the same for Saturn and Mars and Jupiter and Venus, right? So we're observing in relationship to time and space what these bodies are doing. Now, how we come up with the complex interpretation of these planets, we don't have to save that for another day. But the whole point is that astrology is rooted in this observation, and that in astrology, everything is about visibility. When we're talking about the houses, we're talking about observable, astronomical, physical phenomenon in space and time. When we're talking about a Saturn return, or where the sun is, or what the moon is doing, again, we're talking about observable phenomenon. So, 3 pieces now. Astrology is a language, which I've explained what that is. Astrology is a tool for measuring time. I've explained what that is. And astrology is a visible, astrology is rooted in astronomy, which is the tangible, physical, measurable cycles and phenomenon of the planets, what they're doing in relationship to themselves and what they're doing in relationship to each other, right? So I want to switch gears really quick because I'm running out of time quick, and I want to talk about what the zodiac is, okay? The zodiac is a tool for measuring time. See? You see how that goes, right? If astrology is a tool for naming and interpreting time, astrology is a tool for measuring and naming time, right? Interpreting time. The zodiac is not a real thing, okay? This is really important. The zodiac is not a thing that you can look into the sky and be like, aha, there's the zodiac. What are real things are constellations, and constellations are clusters of stars that have been named for a variety of reasons in space and time across a variety of cultures, okay? So these stars have names. There are many constellations and many stars, but we have somehow distilled down to 12 of them. 12 is a very, very important number. If you look at how we measure time over the day, if we look at what was the other thing I was going to say? If we look at the spiritually significant stories across cultures, 12 becomes a very important number. Okay, so somehow we've distilled down to 12, and these 12 names are not measured by the physical astronomical phenomenon of constellations, okay? So in that sense, there are 3 zodiacs. There is a constellational zodiac, which associates each zodiac sign with the constellations and how they appear really in space. There is a very, 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 very small portion of astrologers who use a constellational zodiac. And some of them don't even use 12 signs. They use 13 signs, which is like, why are you using 13 instead of 30? I don't know. There's a lot of constellations. That's a whole nother conversation. Number 2, there is a tropical zodiac. And this is the zodiac that we're most familiar with. The tropical zodiac centers the relationship between the sun and the earth, and the cycles of the sun and the earth over the course of a day and over the course of a year, right? The tropical zodiac says that we will begin measuring and naming time, which we're going to call Aries, on the first day of spring, which is the spring equinox. So at the spring equinox, the sun is doing something specific in relationship to the ecliptic, okay? And all zodiacs, well, except for the constellational zodiac, when we talk about the tropical and sidereal zodiac, they are projecting onto a band of the sky where the sun appears to travel this 12 signs of 30 degrees each, okay? So the tropical zodiacs, all zodiacs are asking, where are we going to start measuring astrological time? Astrological time begins with 0 Aries, and where are we going to begin measuring that? The tropical zodiac says we are going to begin measuring astrological time, 0 degrees Aries, when the sun reaches the equidistant point, right, which is the equinox. Okay, so the first day of spring, the sun is at 0 Aries, right? The first day of summer, the sun is at 0 Cancer. The first day of autumn, the sun is at 0 Leo. And the first day of winter, the sun is at 0 Capricorn. So in this sense, the tropical zodiac centers the sun. What is the sun doing? Okay, now what is the sun doing specifically in relationship to Earth? Okay. The sidereal zodiac is asking the same question. Where does the zodiac begin? Where is 0 Aries, right? Where are we going to start measuring astrological time? Okay. The sidereal zodiac says we're going to do this on the day that the fixed star Spica is setting on the western horizon during sunrise. Okay. The fixed star Spica is in the Pisces constellation. So 0 Aries is going to be when that day, right, the sun ingresses 0 Aries at the moment that the fixed star Spica, the sun, I'm sorry, let me say that correctly. 0 Aries in the sidereal zodiac begins at the moment that the sun reaches the point 180 degrees opposed to the fixed star Spica. So in ancient times, farmers or the scribes or whoever were responsible for making calendars and keeping track of time for the king or the queen, they knew that it was the first day of spring because on that day the fixed star Spica set as the sun was rising. Okay, I'm gonna say that again. The ancients knew that it was the first day of spring because on that day the fixed star Spica set on the western horizon as the sun rose on the eastern horizon. So at that moment and that time period, the tropical zodiac and the sidereal zodiac and how they measured time were the same. They were on top of each other. But because of the precession of the equinoxes, just please Google, eventually this started to drift apart. However, for a very long period of time, we did not have, well, I'm not going to say we, I'm going to say Western, the Hellenistic astrology tradition, Babylonians, Mesopotamians, all of those people, Sumerians, did not have the complex technology that allowed them to precisely measure where something was, right? So this kind of goes back to what I was talking about yesterday with the Mercury in Pisces and how all language is an approximation for what really is. All language is a consensus about how we want to talk about or perceive something. So astrology is really the same way. So at some point, someone arbitrarily decided that the tropical zodiac was the real zodiac. And as Western culture is apt to do, when a white man says something, it must be true. I mean, that's just the way that it is. If a white man says something, it must be true. So let's all abandon the sidereal zodiac, except for India, because India was like, I don't know about that. That's a whole different thing. Their tradition is a little bit different. But yeah, so that is the astronomical differences between the tropical and sidereal zodiac. And that's all I really have time to talk about today. Tomorrow, I am going to talk about mutable madness. And I'm going to talk about Virgo, since the moon is going to be in Virgo Thursday and Friday. The moon enters Virgo tonight, but moon is going to square Venus and Saturn Friday. I think I have to check that because Venus might change signs before the moon has a chance to square it. I'll have to check that. But anyways, that's what I'm going to talk about tomorrow. If you missed the beginning of this video, it will be up on my page until it expires, and I will also be uploading it to YouTube so you can watch it later. My videos from the past, however many I've done, are all up on YouTube. So you could just search the People's Oracle on YouTube. And that's that on that. You guys have a happy Wednesday. Y'all on the East Coast, I hope y'all are staying safe and y'all got enough food for the little storm y'all are having. Have a wonderful day, y'all.